America's Cold Wars in Southeast Asia. Now, why Cold Wars? It's generally accepted that the world experienced two Cold Wars in the aftermath of the Second World War between the communist and non-communist worlds. Southeast Asia is no exception to this general pattern, and in Southeast Asia, the first Cold War was fought roughly between 1949 and 1975, the second between 1979 and 1989. During the First Cold War, the primary objective of the United States was to contain the spread of communism from Indochina. So initially, they supported the French in their efforts to defeat the Viet Minh insurgency. When this failed, they had to acquiesce in the establishment of a North Vietnamese regime, and they gradually escalated their support, both material support and in terms of military manpower, to support the anti-communist regime in South Vietnam. The idea was, according to the domino theory of the time, that if South Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of the region would very soon follow. Support and advice, which typified activities in the 1950s, turned into direct military involvement in the 1960s. And of course, the United States also expanded the war into Laos in the 1960s, and in a direct sense into Cambodia in 1970, from 1970 to 1975, more or less. This is traditionally regarded as a failure of American foreign relations because they were unable to prevent the collapse of South Vietnam and the imposition of Vietnamese dominance in Indochina more generally. However, during these decades, during this First Cold War, the United States makes alliances with three countries that prove to be far more enduring, namely Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia. In Thailand, the United States set up a series of military installations and a number of air bases, and eventually posted some 50,000 American military personnel in the country, not so much to defend Thailand from the spread of communism as to fight the Indochina War, which they did, largely through aerial action. Most of the air war, for example, against North Vietnam was conducted through Thai air bases. In exchange, on a kind of quid pro quo basis, there aren't a lot of treaties here. A lot of these agreements were actually oral. The United States rendered on to the Thai military elite substantial quantities of material assistance and monetary aid, weaponry, training, and so on and so forth. And this is going to have lasting impact, as I will get to later on. In the case of the Philippines, the United States wanted unhampered access to two massive American military installations, Clark Air Base and Subic Bay Naval Base. And in order to assure ready and complete access to these installations, they supported a dictator, Ferdinand Marcos, who would be able to squelch any constitutional or congressional opposition to the operation of these naval bases. In the Indonesian case, you witness something a scenario in which the United States supports anti-communist elements within the Indonesian army and encourages them openly, with their allies, the Australians and the British in particular, to overthrow the increasingly radical regime of Sukarno, which was tilting more and more to the left, allying with the PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party. And in exchange for crushing the Communist Party in a bloody kind of political pogrom in 1965 and 1966, the United States extends massive economic assistance to Indonesia and brings it back into the international global economy. The Second Cold War, interestingly enough, proves far more successful for the United States without the application of massive amounts of military manpower, at least not directly by the United States. This manpower comes from two allies that are in a position to continue to harm Vietnam. Not so much because the United States really believed in the domino theory by that point, certainly not by the 1980s, but Vietnam had become a host to a series of Soviet military installations, and there was a kind of revanchist notion that Vietnam should be punished for the pain it had caused the United States, certainly among right-wing figures in the United States. How did the American policymakers go about isolating and destabilizing Vietnam? They do it because the Vietnamese invade Cambodia in December 1978, and by January 1979, they have toppled the Pol Pot Khmer Rouge regime. However, the Khmer Rouge flee to bases in Thailand, and the Thai military government at the time allows the Chinese to supply the Khmer Rouge through Thai territory in exchange for the Chinese withdrawing support from the Communist Party of Thailand. This allows Thailand to win its domestic Cold War, whilst at the same time prosecuting a Cold War action, Cold War activities against its Vietnamese enemy in neighboring Cambodia, which neighbors Thailand. In the case of the Philippines, the base structure remains as vital as ever because the United States pursues, after 1975, a Pacific Rim strategy, meaning essentially the United States will exert its influence in the Asia-Pacific, the Western Asia-Pacific, via the presence of naval and air forces to act as a deterrent against expanding Soviet military force and as a means of containing and bottling in Vietnam and its own aspirations. So in a sense, as Vietnam becomes more and more of a Soviet satellite in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the United States becomes more and more committed to maintaining its bases in the Philippines. Indonesia, interestingly enough, is neutral on the surface. It espouses a neutralist ideology, but this neutralism was never very convincing to most observers. Beneath a lot of rhetoric and certain symbolic cosmetic actions to demonstrate its neutrality, you can see very easily, and most people saw very easily at the time, that the Indonesian military, the New Order regime, was very closely allied with the United States, sending military officers to be trained in the United States, and the United States providing weapon sales and massive numbers of weapons transfers to the Indonesian military in the late 70s and well into the 1980s. This allows Suharto to remain on side and gives the United States a loyal anti-communist client in Southeast Asia's largest and most populous state, and also allows, should the need arise, free access to strategic sea lanes from Subic Naval Base if there is a greater big power conflict. Should one arise, the United States can use Subic Bay and enter the Indonesian archipelago relatively easily without too much trouble. Some Indonesian commentators in the 1980s used to say the Philippines hosts American military bases, so we don't have to. All right. Eventually, of course, in 1989, under unremitting pressure, the Vietnamese withdraw from Cambodia and begin to actively pursue capitalist development and the beginnings of some form of rapprochement with the United States, whereby the United States can deal with Vietnam from a relatively large position of strength, at that time at least. So, why is this important? Why should we consider the Cold War in Southeast Asia today when the events in question ended more than 30 years ago? It's terribly important to understand that if we want to understand the present, we need to understand what happened in the past. And what did happen in the past was a series of localizations of American power. Now, localization is a term developed by the late Cornell historian Oliver Wolters, wherein he argues that exogenous or external forces, political, religious, in traditional Southeast Asia were indigenized, were incorporated into local cultural and political systems to the indigenous people's benefit, or to the ability, it aided in the ability of rulers to govern their subjects and keep them loyal to them. In the United States case, localization is not so much cultural, it's not so much political necessarily as it is military. American military power was localized and deployed to indigenous benefit. In the case of Thailand, of course, the Thai military becomes much richer, much more powerful, much more lethal, if not always very effectively so. And more importantly, I think, anti-communist ideological currents politicized the Thai monarchy and during the 1960s, and that politicization remains with us in many respects until this very day. In the case of Indonesia, the military's role is much more muted today. It's not absent entirely, but it is certainly reduced. However, the American elimination, or the American encouragement to eliminate the left in Indonesia, resulted in the Islamist political movement filling that vacuum, and Islamism remains very, very powerful and increasingly powerful in Indonesia today. In the case of the Philippines, the military was very politicized as a result of U.S. support. Certain machinations by Ferdinand Marcos played a role, and some earlier presidents as well. But the United States does maintain separate linkages with the Philippine military, and when it wants to exercise its prerogatives or pursue its interests in the Philippines today, it largely does so through senior military commanders or defense officials, not so much through elected politicians. They will do business with elected politicians if they're willing to play ball, but if they aren't, they're willing to get their, or try to get their way through senior military commanders. The Americans are using this conduit of Washington to military linkages to pursue their interests, attempting to at least, until the present day. So in many respects, if we want to understand Southeast Asia's current state, we need to understand its past Cold Wars.